Hello, my name is Neil Gregor. I'm Professor of Modern European History at the University of Southampton, and I'm the Director of the Parkes Institute. In this short film, we're going to be looking at the CCJ, the Council of Christians and Jews, the papers of which we hold here in our university special collections. And I'm delighted that I've been joined by Dr. Rob Thompson, who is a distinguished expert in the history of the CCJ, and who for many years also worked for the CCJ Council of Christians and Jews. So Rob, thank you. Welcome, and thanks for coming. So Rob, tell me a bit about the foundation of the CCJ. How significant a moment was that? Was it really something that came out of nowhere, or did it draw on predecessors, antecedents? Can you sketch something of that for us?
Yes. Well, I think the founding of CCJ was significant because it was the first time that there became a truly national and interdenominational organisation for Christian and Jewish relations in the UK. Of course, there had been instances of Christian-Jewish cooperation before. Activists had worked together on social and political issues, from women's suffrage to the conditions of the working classes in the East End of London, for example. Scholars had written books and articles and conducted studies on Christian-Jewish relations. Of course, James Parkes' first book was published in 1930, so it's 12 years before the founding of CCJ. And there have been other organisations, and I think the most prominent of those would have been the London Society for Christians and Jews. But the limitations of that organisation, of course, firstly, the clue is in the name. It was geographically limited. But secondly, although there were a number of Christians and prominent Christians and Jews involved in the London Society, it was supported neither by the chief rabbi or by Orthodox Judaism. It was very much a movement within liberal Judaism. And successive archbishops of Canterbury were also not particularly active in the London Society. But what stood out when CCJ was created was that both the Archbishop of Canterbury and the chief rabbi both became figureheads of the organisation. And I think the fact that those two leaders bringing a breadth of denominational expressions, the fact that those two figures came together was significant. Alongside that, I think the context of CCJ's founding makes it significant as well. So the first conversations were taking place in the summer and autumn of 1941. The decision to create CCJ occurs in the spring of 42, and then finally the public announcement is made in the autumn. So this is all taking place at the height of the Second World War. There have been several years of campaigning on behalf of refugees from Nazi Germany. Anti-Semitism is rising in the UK, and news is beginning to filter through of the mass murder of Jews in occupied Europe. And so I think it's fair to say that there's a symbolic significance to the founding of CCJ, that for all its limitations, and there were limitations to its work, that there was an opportunity for a positive coming together of Christians and Jews at this moment, when conditions for Jews elsewhere in Europe are at their most dire. I think that's a symbolic significance that we shouldn't forget.
So what role did James Parkes himself play in this one?
Well, there's two competing stories about the founding of CCJ, or certainly the decision to found CCJ. The first story is James Parkes' story, which is that there was a conversation under a pear tree in his garden at his home in Barley between Parkes and Kathleen Freeman, who was a Church of England layperson active in refugee issues, and that they had a conversation in the orchard and decided that there needed to be a Council of Christians and Jews. The competing story is that of William Simpson, who was the founding secretary of CCJ. And Simpson maintained that CCJ was born out of conversations between Christian and Jewish activists in Bloomsbury House, which was the centre for the refugee movement in London. Whichever story is the most true, and I think both have truth in those stories, I think it suggests that Parkes had an important role within CCJ's founding. Not so much on the organisational side of things, and I think Parkes himself admitted later on that if he had been responsible for the day-to-day running of CCJ, it would never have lasted. I don't think he was the sort of person who had those skills to manage an organisation, and Simpson was much more adept at those at that work. But he's undoubtedly had a huge intellectual influence on the creation of CCJ. He was the most prominent writer and campaigner on these issues in his time. He did not always agree with his colleagues in CCJ, and other activists and leaders within CCJ certainly took different approaches, but I think we can certainly say that without his scholarship, there would not have been the movement and the decision to come together in that moment in 41, 42, whether it was in his garden or in Bloomsbury House in London.
So how much of an impact would you say that the CCJ had when it was founded? Is it a big splash? Does it change a lot? Are there limitations? You alluded to those a bit earlier.
I think there's certainly a short-term impact in that CCJ, its creation was reported on in the press. So on the 1st of October 1942, there was an article in the Times announcing CCJ's founding, and certainly it drew very prominent figures from Anglo Jewry, from the Christian community into its ranks. And CCJ, in its early days, particularly during those war years, tried to really make a difference to some of the big issues of the time. They were very concerned about rising anti-Semitism. They commented in particular on anti-Semitism in the way in which the black market was reported on, for example, during the war years. They campaigned on issues such as refugees. They sent a delegation to the Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison. William Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury, spoke up in the House of Lords about the news about persecution and mass murder of Jews in Europe. On all of these issues, it's questionable just how much of a tangible impact they could have, or certainly how they did have, and Morrison was intractable in his response to them, and Archbishop Temple sadly died before the end of the war. So there were issues during the war that CCJ took to its heart and really tried to raise awareness of, but I think they were limited in terms of what they could achieve on those issues.
It's interesting to me that you're foregrounding particularly the social and political activism of the CCJ. Of course, there's a conversation going on that we might, I suppose, loosely call a more theological conversation about the relationship between Christianity and Jews, which turns on the long-standing traditions of evangelism, the desire to convert, which is starting to be a bit more controversial around this time. Mm-hmm. Does the CCJ play a pivotal role in shaping those conversations? Or?
Well, I think the issue of evangelism and conversion is really the issue on which Parkes diverges, I think, from others within CCJ, and where we might see some of the limitations to CCJ's effectiveness on some of the issues relating to Christian-Jewish relations. Archbishop Temple, who helped create the CCJ, although he was prominent in raising awareness of anti-Semitism and clearly deplored anti-Semitism, he felt that it should not be the focus of CCJ's work, that too much talk about anti-Semitism was too negative, drawing attention to it might in fact increase anti-Semitism. So Archbishop Temple, preferred that CCJ really have a much more positive outlook, that it would present the similarities, the points of connection between Christians and Jews, those principles which unite them, and on which they could show a united front and a show of tolerance. Parkes was much more of an activist, and I think more of a realist, shall we say, about Christianity and about the nature of Christians' theology. Parkes wrote even early in the 1930s that Christians had a responsibility to ensure that Jews had a square deal to be Jews. And he would say in a sermon at the University of Oxford in 1939 that the Christian had a responsibility to make the world safe for the Jew to be a Jew. And what he meant by that was that Judaism had a distinct, separate, and equally valid relationship with God. And therefore, they didn't need to be converted. And that Judaism and Christianity could exist alongside one another as equally valid expressions of a relationship with the same God. And this was radical for its time. And it challenged people like Archbishop Temple, who was patron of the Christian Missionary Society to the Jews. And Parkes famously wrote to him during the Second World War, asking him to renounce that patronage, and Temple refused. And so I think that's the tension within CCJ, that you have activists like Parkes who really want to push Christianity to change genuinely in its approach to Judaism, and those who are still finding that too much of a challenge to their own theology, and who would rather promote the positive angle and not sometimes the things that made them slightly more uncomfortable.
So we've talked quite a lot about the war years and the foundational years. Of course, the CCJ is still in existence now. Can you say a little bit about how the CCJ evolved in the post-war period?
Yeah, so CCJ was a national organisation at the beginning, but I think in the post-war years, it certainly spread more into local communities, and it established local branches so that local Christians and Jews could come together, meet one another, engage in educational activities and points of contact where they could learn about one another and show solidarity on local issues as well as issues to do with religion and theology. And I think CCJ developed more and more into an educational organisation. At the beginning, this was another issue that its leaders and founders disagreed on. Many were fearful that an educational organisation teaching one another about their respective faiths would lead to a blurring of the boundaries and the points of separation. But I think CCJ has, as the decades have gone on, has embraced that educational role more and more, especially on the Christian side. And since the Second Vatican Council and in the 1960s, and the change that led to in Roman Catholic teaching on Judaism, CCJ has really taken on a responsibility to teach Christians about a long history of anti-Semitism, a long history of anti-Semitism within the church, and to suggest those points where Christianity might reevaluate their teaching in relation to Jews. And I think also CCJ has maintained a national presence, has certainly had representatives within the national religious bodies, government level, connections in government. But I think there's always still that challenge. We think about the long-term impact of CCJ. Certainly Christian-Jewish relations have improved enormously since 1942. But we might question whether that distinction between Parkes' approach and Temple's approach, whether that disagreement is still live today, to what extent Christianity has truly got to grips with its long history of anti-Semitism and with that challenge of Parkes to make the world safe for a Jew to be a Jew.
We have a few documents here from both the CCJ and the William Simpson collections, just appertaining to some of the history of the councils of Christians and Jews. You talked earlier about the completing stories about the foundation of the CCJ. I don't know whether this is another strand of that, but this is a report on a meeting that they had over lunch at Grosvenor House in 1941, where there's a discussion of the foundation of an interfaith committee. It's actually chaired by William Temple, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and as you can see from this, it's a confidential copy of that. I just wondered what your comments were on how it reflects very much the sort of ideas and attitudes of those who were involved in this discussion.
Well, it's fascinating to see the minutes here of this meeting, which, as you say, is another important point in the story of how CCJ is founded. This lunch at which the Archbishop of Canterbury and other people really managed to convince, I think, the chief rabbi to come on board and support CCJ's creation. And what I find particularly interesting is the names that appear in these minutes. Really important people in Christian-Jewish relations, in Jewish communal organisations, the Board of Deputies, the Chief Rabbi, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and also in refugee issues. So one of the names is Henry Carter, who was, like Simpson, a Methodist minister, but really prominent in Christian campaigning on refugees and supporting refugees from Nazi Germany. But reading the text of the discussions, what's fascinating is that it highlights already at this early point the differences in the approaches that certain figures brought to the table. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, in his opening remarks, references the wartime context, this discussion of nationalism and racism and anti-Semitism and what all of those mean in the context of the war and Nazi Germany, and therefore what Christians and Jews in the UK, how they should be working together and addressing these issues. And the Archbishop of Canterbury says if that is to be effective, it should be as far as possible positive. And I think that reflects what we were discussing about that slight difference and nuance between his approach and James Parks's, that is to emphasise the points at which that Christians and Jews share, as opposed to the potentially negative aspects of Christian anti-Semitism, and that this positive approach might be a more effective way of bringing people on side and emphasising the opportunities for Christians and Jews to work together.
So here we have an item that's taken from William Simpson papers, really dating from the 1970s, where he's looking back at some of the developments and some of the work that the CCJ has undertaken since its foundation, and it's looking at sort of, in particular, Christian teaching and anti-Semitism. So I just wondered if you would perhaps like to sort of comment on how much impact you feel that the CCJ had in sort of influencing the way teaching was undertaken with regard to anti-Semitism.
Well, this is what's interesting is this allows us to see some of the progress, I think, that's been made in Christian-Jewish relations since CCJ's founding, because the pamphlet references firstly it references the Seelisberg Conference of 1947, at which Christians and Jews from around the world came together in Seelisberg to think about how Christians can begin to change their teachings in relation to Jews and to challenge anti-Semitism. And the Seelisberg Conference resulted in their so-called 10 points, all of which refer to the ways in which Christians approach Scripture, to approach the Bible and their teachings, the ways in which they talk about Jews and emphasise Jesus' Jewishness. And the second sort of development that the pamphlet references is the Vatican Council and its declaration of 1965, which really transformed Roman Catholic Jewish relations. So we see here a huge amount of progress, and we also see what CCJ is therefore doing in this country, in its own communities, to spread those messages. And so it offers some practical suggestions for Christians to become more aware of the sensitivities around anti-Semitism and Jewish teaching, to simply learn more about Judaism, and to read the statements that various churches have made since the Holocaust to improve relations. And so I think we see progress, and we see the CCJ taking on more of an educational role, seeing its purpose very much in terms of what it can do to change Christian teaching and attitudes.
So here we have something that very much dates it, which is a fax reporting on an event at Downing Street for the CCJ. Quite a fascinating document in itself. But I also wanted to ask you, how effective do you think the CCJ was in engaging and influencing the political establishment to their cause?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it sort of speaks to something of the contradiction of CCJ, in that in some ways it is an establishment organisation. Its leadership are often leaders within
indeed.
the established church and politics, and here has almost a route to the centre of power. A reception at Downing Street and a whole evening with the Prime Minister, and one might argue, that might be one of the limitations of CCJ. How far can it challenge people in positions of power? And yet we also get a real insight into the continuing relevance of CCJ's work, because the article references the speeches that are made at this reception, and one of the speeches is given by Richard Harries, who was then the Bishop of Oxford and chair of CCJ, and he says that CCJ's work is not over. It can't be wrapped up, and it had to be continued in every generation. And I think that's quite interesting, because it speaks to the continuing relevance of CCJ. It was created by the wartime generation in very different circumstances, and yet anti-Semitism continues and has to be addressed in every generation. And so CCJ very much here demonstrating that continuing relevance, I think.